Fire on the plateau. They say war makes you old before your time. I believe it. I was just a kid from Nebraska when I landed on Leyte, but I felt like an old man by the time I left. It wasn't the jungle rot or the hunger that aged me. It was the way the enemy fought, the way they came from nowhere and disappeared like ghosts, the way you could never let your guard down, not for a second. You never knew if the next step you took would be the last one. And it all came to a head on that damn plateau, where the fire never seemed to die. We called it the Hell Plateau. The official maps didn't have a name for it, just some numbers and coordinates, but Hell Plateau fit just fine. It sat at the edge of the valley, overlooking a river that ran like a silver snake through the jungle. The Japanese had dug themselves in deep. Tunnels, bunkers, machine gun nests, you name it. From the air, it just looked like another piece of jungle, but underneath it was a fortress. We had no choice but to take it. Our orders were simple: mortar fire first, then infantry would move in and clear out the survivors. I was part of the mortar crew. My job was to drop shells and keep the fire going. Sounds easy, but in the jungle, nothing's easy. The ground was wet, the air was thick with the stink of rot and sweat, and every time you moved, you felt like 100 eyes were watching. The first night, we pounded the plateau with everything we had. The mortars roared, and the jungle lit up like a 4th of July show back home. Flames leaped into the sky, and the ground shook like it was alive. We thought we'd bury them under the rubble, but when the firing stopped, the jungle went dead silent. No screams, no movement, just stillness. That's when we knew we were in trouble. The next morning, the infantry moved in, and that's when the real nightmare began. The Japanese weren't dead. They weren't even wounded. They had been hiding, waiting, letting us think we had the upper hand. Then, like demons out of the earth, they came. They poured out of holes in the ground, from beneath fallen logs, from the thick underbrush. I saw it with my own eyes. One of our guys, Murphy, stepped onto what he thought was solid ground. The earth caved in, and before he could react, hands reached up, dragged him down, and he was gone. Just gone. No scream, no struggle, just swallowed by the jungle. We never saw him again. Panic spread through our ranks. Men fired blindly into the trees, into the earth itself. It didn't matter. The enemy was already among us. Some of them didn't even carry rifles. They came with bayonets, knives, sharpened bamboo sticks. It was up close, it was personal, and it was pure hell. I lost track of time. I dropped mortar shells as fast as my hands would allow. My whole body was shaking, my arms numb from the recoil. The smell of gunpowder, blood, and burned jungle filled my lungs. I remember the screams, some American, some Japanese, all of them blending into one awful symphony of death. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the attack stopped. The jungle swallowed the enemy again. The plateau was ours, but we knew the battle wasn't over. The tunnels were still there. They were still watching, still waiting. And deep down, we knew that the real fight hadn't even begun yet. The night after we took the plateau was the longest of my life. We had the high ground, but that didn't mean a damn thing. The jungle was still against us, still hiding the enemy like a mother protecting her young. Every shadow looked like a soldier. Every rustle in the leaves sent fingers of ice crawling down my spine. We set up a perimeter, laid out whatever trip flares and mines we had left, and tried to catch a few hours of sleep. But no one really slept. You don't sleep when you know the enemy is beneath your feet, crawling through tunnels like rats, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sometime past midnight, I heard the first scream. Not a gunshot, not a grenade, just a scream ripped from a man's throat like his soul was being torn out. Then another, and another. I gripped my rifle, so tight my fingers ached, my back pressed against a damp trench wall. The air was thick with sweat and fear. Then the plateau came alive again. Grenades rolled into foxholes before men could react. Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden ground openings, slicing through our ranks with blades and bayonets. It wasn't a firefight. It was a slaughter. We fought in the flickering light of burning debris, in the smoke and chaos, where you couldn't tell friend from foe until it was too late. I remember seeing Johnson, a guy from my mortar team, swinging his rifle like a club, his helmet missing, his face smeared with dirt and blood. He took down one enemy, then another. But the third was faster. A blade flashed in the dark, and Johnson staggered, his mouth opening in shock. No words, just breath, just blood. He collapsed before I could reach him. I dropped to my knees, shaking hands, fumbling with a grenade. My fingers pulled the pin almost without thinking, and I threw it into the nearest tunnel opening. The explosion sent a geyser of dirt and rock into the air. For a moment, the screams stopped. Just for a moment. When the dust settled, there was movement from the ruins of a collapsed bunker. At first, I thought it was another attack. I raised my rifle, ready to fire. But then I saw him, a single Japanese soldier, his face streaked with soot, his uniform torn. He wasn't running. He wasn't fighting. He was crawling, dragging his broken body across the ground. His eyes met mine, dark pools of exhaustion, and something else, something I couldn't place. Regret. Acceptance. I don't know what made me hesitate, but I did. My finger froze on the trigger. He was dying, and he knew it. We both knew it. His breath was ragged, shallow. He muttered something in Japanese, words I didn't understand. But his voice, it wasn't hatred. It wasn't anger. It was just tired. Then, with a final sigh, he stopped moving. The battle wasn't over, but for that brief moment, the jungle fell silent again. And I realized something. It didn't matter how many tunnels we destroyed, how many soldiers we killed. This war had no end, not really. It just kept swallowing men whole, turning them into shadows in the dirt. And I had no idea if I'd ever crawl out of it alive. By morning, the jungle reeked of blood and gunpowder. Smoke curled from craters where the tunnels had collapsed, but we all knew it wasn't over. The enemy was still down there, burrowed like termites in the earth, waiting. We had taken the plateau, but at what cost? Half our squad was gone. Some dead, some just missing, swallowed up by the jungle like Murphy had been. No trace, no bodies, just silence. Command wanted us to push forward, but that meant one thing, going into the tunnels. It was the only way to root them out for good. They sent in the tunnel rats first, guys smaller than me, carrying .45s and flashlights, crawling into the black maw of the earth. I could never do it. Never. The thought of squeezing into that darkness, knowing death could be inches away, was enough to make my skin crawl. The first two guys never came back. We waited. No gunshots, no explosions. Just nothing. Then it was our turn. I wasn't supposed to go in, but orders change when you're low on men. They handed me a sidearm, strapped a knife to my belt, and shoved a flashlight in my hand. The entrance was barely wide enough for my shoulders. The air coming out was stale, thick with the stink of rot and sweat. I swallowed hard and crawled in. Inside, the darkness was absolute. My breath echoed off the walls. The ground beneath me was damp, soft, not with water, but with something else. I didn't want to think about it. I kept moving, inch by inch, until I heard it. Breathing. Not mine. I froze. My pulse pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. The beam of my flashlight flickered over a figure in the dark. He was crouched there, his uniform caked with dirt, eyes wide and hollow. Young, probably no older than me. He wasn't holding a rifle, just a knife. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Neither of us moved. Neither of us breathed. Then, from deeper in the tunnel, something shifted. A whisper. A scraping sound. There were more of them. And they knew I was here. I fired. The shot was deafening in the tight space. The figure in front of me slumped forward, his knife clattering to the ground. But I had no time to think, no time to process. Shadows moved ahead. I turned, scrambling back the way I came, but the tunnel seemed smaller now, the air hotter, thicker. A hand shot out from the dirt, grabbing my ankle. I kicked wildly, my boot connecting with something solid. A grunt of pain. I crawled faster, my shoulders scraping against the walls. The exit was close. I could see the faintest sliver of light. Almost there. Then something exploded behind me. A shockwave punched through the tunnel, and suddenly I was airborne, flung forward like a rag doll. I hit the ground hard, my ears ringing, my vision swimming. When I looked back, the tunnel entrance had collapsed. Whatever or whoever had been behind me was gone. Buried alive. I sucked in a breath, tasting ash and sweat. I was out. I was alive. But as I looked around at the smoldering jungle, at the exhausted, hollow-eyed men around me, I realized something. I had crawled out of that hole, but part of me was still buried down there, lost in the dark. And I wasn't sure if I'd ever get it back. The battle for the plateau was over. At least, that's what the officers told us. The maps showed our lines pushing forward, deeper into the island, but those maps didn't show the ghosts. They didn't show the men who vanished in the night, the foxholes that went silent before dawn, the whispers that ran through the camp like a fever. Some men swore they still heard movement under the ground. Not enemy scouts, not survivors, something else. They'd wake up in the middle of the night, gasping, clutching their rifles, swearing they'd heard voices beneath them. Murmurs in a language they didn't understand, echoing up from the dirt like the jungle itself was speaking. We laughed it off at first. Just nerves, we said. Just the jungle playing tricks. But deep down, we all knew better. One night, a guy named Wilkes, good soldier, solid guy, went to take a leak behind the supply crates. He never came back. No gunshot, no struggle. Just gone. When we searched for him in the morning, all we found were his boots, sitting neatly in the mud, like he just stepped out of them and walked away. A week passed, then another. The enemy had pulled back, but the jungle never felt empty. The shadows stretched longer. The nights pressed in tighter. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I was cleaning my rifle when I saw movement near the tree line. Just a flicker. A shape. I raised my weapon, heart hammering, but the figure didn't move like a soldier. It just stood there, half hidden in the brush. I squinted, trying to make out details. A uniform? A helmet? No, it was something else. Then the wind shifted, and I heard it. A voice? Not a shout, not a command, just a whisper. My name. I dropped my rifle. My hands felt numb. The jungle swayed, the leaves rustling like they were laughing at me. I turned to call for someone, anyone, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. That night, I didn't sleep. None of us did. At dawn, orders came down. We were moving out, pushing deeper into the island. The war wasn't done with us yet, but as we packed our gear, I felt something under my boot. A piece of cloth, faded, dirty, but I recognized it. It was part of Wilkes' uniform. I picked it up slowly, my fingers tracing the torn edge. It was damp, not with rain, not with sweat, with something darker, something warm. I never told the others, because deep down I knew. The battle for the plateau had never really ended, and maybe it never would. The troop transports rumbled down the jungle road at dawn, their engines coughing against the damp air. We were leaving the plateau behind, pushing deeper into the island, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had stayed with us. The men were quiet. Not the usual quiet of exhaustion. This was different, heavier. Like everyone was afraid to be the first to speak, to acknowledge what we all felt. I sat in the back of the truck, my rifle resting across my knees, watching the jungle blur past. Every twisted root, every shadowed hollow looked like it could swallow a manhole. Then I noticed something. The trees were thinning. The thick undergrowth was giving way to a wide, open clearing. Not natural. The jungle didn't just stop like that. This place, it had been burned, flattened, and at the center of it all, half buried in the blackened dirt, were bones. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. The convoy slowed. Some of the men stood up, craning their necks, muttering under their breath. No one wanted to say what we were all thinking. This wasn't just some battlefield. It was older than that. The bones were bleached white, stripped clean by time and the elements. Some still wore rusted bits of armor, the remains of weapons long turned to dust. I remembered something an old Filipino scout had told us when we first landed. About the island. About its past. This land is hungry, he had said. It has always been hungry. I didn't understand it then. I did now. The officer in the lead jeep signaled for us to keep moving. No one argued. We didn't want to be here any longer than we had to. As the trucks rolled forward, I glanced back one last time. The jungle loomed beyond the clearing, thick and untouched. But just before the trees swallowed the view, I saw something move. A figure. Standing at the edge of the bones. Watching us. I didn't tell the others. Because deep down, I knew they had seen it too.